Abraham Lincoln shared that he was not concerned about having God on his side because he was more concerned about being on God's side. And in politics, there's definitely sides. There's the Republican red side and Democrat blue. And this conversation right now is going to be based on that Republican perception. In history, there are always these sides. So today we're going to have a conversation with Terry Carmack, who has been with Senator Mitch McConnell since the beginning of the Senator's run in 1984. Fellas, this is another episode of Decades, Republican Perspective.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Left in the game. You believe in miracles? Yes!
Right, oh my God, another plane has just hit another building.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Not have sexual relations.
Welcome back, guys, to another one of our class sessions. This time in class, we have with us Terry Carmack, who started with Senator McConnell in 1984. He actually became a junior staffer in the Bush administration. That's Bush 41. Then he came back to Kentucky to be the political director for Senator McConnell, shifted over to Representative Ann Northup's staff as the chief of staff, and now is the state director for Kentucky for Senator McConnell. Terry, thank you so much for being a part of our class today. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Coach. Glad to be here. It's a really interesting time we live in right now as we are talking, and I hope your students will find something valuable out of our conversation.
Now, as I just shared, you have had a long career in Washington. You have worked with the administrations of Ronald Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton administration, Bush 43, the Obama administration, now and the Trump administration. As you look back in your career at this point, what are some of the things that you feel very proud of, some of the legislations you've worked with, the things that you can look back and the highlights of this career of yours?
Well, first of all, being in Washington, D.C. is a great honor. And I would encourage your students, if they're interested in history and politics, to take a look at that. There's all kinds of ways to get there. There are internships and so forth. So it's a really exciting place to be. And keep in mind, when I got there in 1985, Ronald Reagan was president. And so I was a junior staffer. So I wasn't involved. But there were some things that happened that were, critical and sort of defining moments, I would say. I mean, keep in mind when President Reagan came into office, we'd just been through the Iranian hostage crisis where 52 Americans had been held for 444 days in Iran. And they were released just literally as President Reagan went into office. And so the theme of the Reagan presidency was sort of morning in America. We were not that far removed from Watergate. There was a lot of sense of malaise in the country. And he just brought a new attitude to the whole thing. It was a very optimistic time for our country. But looming over that, I'll just remind you, was the Cold War. And so almost immediately after we got out of World War II, where you always think when you have those victories that, we're going to go through this time of peace and tranquility, and it almost never happens. And so the Cold War was looming and had been looming for 30 years. And President Reagan started to make progress there. It actually, if we just jump on to the Bush administration, Bush 41 right after that is actually the highlight, I think, would be the Berlin Wall actually coming down. And it's hard to describe to people what that was like, where for so many years that was a symbol of a lack of freedom for people if you're in sort of the Soviet sphere. And so I was at the White House when all of that happened in 1989, and it was just a thrilling moment because you finally saw that this Cold War was starting to come to an end. And just, people ask me if I've been to Europe. I haven't traveled all that much, but I did go, was there in 1983 during a college program, and the Berlin Wall was still up. And I went and saw the Berlin Wall. I actually went into East Berlin. And so I'm able to have those pictures that I had in my head, and then to see that wall come down was really a thrilling moment, even from a distance. From there, we went into Clinton, which was, he was actually a moderate Democrat. Not to be too political here, but there aren't many of them left. I'm not sure Bill Clinton would be all that welcome in his party right now, but he did, there was some controversy around his presidency, but also he did some important things like welfare reform that where a bipartisan effort, people came together and did something good for the country. From there, we went into Bush 43, another Bush. That got off to a rocky start because very similar to what we're going through literally right now, there was a big controversy in the election in Florida. And so it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court, and Bush was declared the victory. And then it wasn't long after that until 9/11 and the war on terror, which we can talk about a little bit more. That goes into President Obama. And what can you say? A historic defining moment for our country to see a Black man finally become president of the United States. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think we were all cheering for him to be successful because it sent such an important message, not only in our country, but literally around the world. And now, we've experienced President Trump. He did some things that were pretty amazing. He's a different kind of president, a different kind of leader. But up until COVID hit, we had the best economy that we had ever had in 50 years. Right. I think then, of course, you have the whole COVID situation, which will always be a part of him. And then you have what he and Senator McConnell did in the courts. It's very unusual for a president who was there for 4 years to get to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, 2 of which were incredibly controversial. With Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, though Kavanaugh even more so. Neil Gorsuch, I think it wasn't as controversial, other than the fact that it was just a Republican making an appointment to the Supreme Court.
And that Supreme Court within these last 4 years has now shifted in the political spectrum of going from maybe more liberal to definitely a more conservative with these 3 appointees in the last 4 years.
Well, you would think so, though I will tell you, having watched this over the years, it's really hard to predict what Supreme Court justices are going to do when they get there. There have been appointments made by Republican presidents back in the 1950s and 1960s who ended up being some of the most liberal members of the Supreme Court. That's the beauty of lifetime appointments, is that once they're on there, they can do exactly what they want to do. As Justice Scalia has says, they're supposed to just call the balls and the strikes. They don't wear red robes. They don't wear blue robes. They wear black robes. They're supposed to interpret the law with no outside influence, and they don't. And we've had even justices appointed fairly recently by Republicans that Republicans end up spitting mad over because they made some decision they didn't think they should should make. So it's pretty hard to predict. Some cases you can. They start to fall into certain categories, but there have been a lot of people put on the Supreme Court who didn't turn out to be what people thought they would be.
Now, in your career, you were going through these highlights. I very vividly remember being in high school when President Reagan was at the wall, and he challenged Mr. Gorbachev to open a gate, and then he just made the famous of all the quotes, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And as you said, that wall does come down, but that wall actually comes down in the Bush campaign, and you were a junior staffer on that administration. What was the general feeling in the White House when that happened? I mean, can you go through that?
Well, sure. I mean, it was a moment of elation. I do think President Reagan, rightly so, gets most of the credit, but it did actually happen under President Bush, who, by the way, was a great man, having just passed away fairly recently. We got to see who this man was, his experience, his military career, literally an American hero. And so I'm really glad that someone like President Bush was there, because there was a lot of angst about what was actually going to happen. When this wall comes down, you weren't quite sure whether the Soviet-dominated countries could have still rolled in their tanks, and a lot of people end up getting killed. So there was a lot of anticipation, there was a lot of excitement, but there was a lot of concern as well about exactly how was these Soviet-dominated countries for so long going to be treated, and how were their people going to be treated, and who was in control of their armies, and actually whether Gorbachev is actually in control of his own country. But in some sense, once we knew that it looked like people were going to be able to have freedom, and people in Germany were going to be able to be reunited, it just simply pure elation, because this had been hanging over our heads for 40 years.
Right. Now, transitioning through your time frame, you started with Senator McConnell. You went to the office, the White House, but then when you came back home, you went to work with Representative Ann Northup. What is for my guys who you would think would be a good thing for them to understand, what exactly is it, the differences between the Senate and the House of Representatives, because you've had experience in both of those?
Well, they're of course both part of the legislative branch, and they're both completely different, and for good reasons. The founders, the more you think about history, were pure geniuses trying to put this system together that would be representative government in a fair way, and so they made the House of Representatives much larger. There's now 435 members of Congress. They're elected every 2 years. And in the House, the majority rules. So if you have 218 members, which is what it takes to have control, you can do anything. And everything is done on a simple majority. So if you're the party in charge and you can hold your members together, you can literally ram through bills every single day, and there's very little the opposition can do. They can go down to the House floor and give 1-minute speeches, of which have no effect whatsoever on the outcome of the debate. And so that's the House. And I've been there in the majority, and I was there in the minority, and I can tell you it's a lot more fun being there in the majority, because you can get things done, and you can get them done really fast. Things can happen quickly.
Okay.
The Senate is a totally different body. It's 100 members. Every state, whether you're California or South Dakota, you get 2. And so it's an equalizing body. The other thing is that they have 6-year terms. And so a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. And so you have 33 or 34 members up every 2 years. So what does that do? It takes the pressure of an election that's right around the corner. If you're in the House, even though most of them don't have tough elections, you're up for re-election every 2 years. And in the Senate, that's not the case.
Right.
But most importantly, most things in the Senate, you have to do with a supermajority. So 50 doesn't get it done. It takes 60 to do a lot of things. And so in the Senate, a lot of things, a lot of bad ideas die in the Senate.
Okay.
You have a rush of interest in the House of Representatives. They pass a bill through quickly, and a lot of things go to the Senate to die because there you have to have bipartisanship. So it's rare. It has happened recently where the White House, the Senate would have a supermajority of 60 and would control the House of Representatives as well, and sort of total power in the Congress. And usually what happens after 2 years of that is that there isn't divided power. People take it away because the Senate is there to put the brakes on. It's there to slow things down. It's there to, if you think about football, you being a coach, the Senate sort of plays within the 40-yard lines. The House can run all the way down the field to sort of extremes. The Senate plays in the middle, and that's what's great about the rules of the Senate. And there's a debate going on right now about whether we would ever end the filibuster. That would be a terrible idea because it's the ability to filibuster and get 60 votes to do most things that makes the Senate a unique body, but it also makes sure that whoever's in the minority is not going to be run over, that they're going to get their voice and they're going to be able to be in the ball game in the U.S. Senate. So those are the biggest differences.
Now that you've mentioned like bipartisanship and polarization, if we look at when you came in involved with politics, you were with Reagan, who was also nicknamed the Great Communicator. And one of his strengths was during his 8-year term was he was known for generating bipartisanship. He was able to get people to walk across the aisle and shake hands and get things passed. And when we look at his 8 years terms, the Reagan administration was averaging 670 laws a session. And there was the entirety of Reagan's 8 years, only 14 legislative failures. But when we look at the last decade, and we're seeing that we're averaging only 309 enacted laws, so less than half of what was Reagan. And just in the last 10 years, there's been 118 legislative failures. So clearly we're seeing evidence of a polarized Congress instead of a bipartisan Congress. Is this dangerous for the American people to be this polarized? And is there a way for us to get back to being bipartisan?
Well, look, I think it is more partisan right now than it had been previously, but there are some reasons for that. But let me back up to say this, is that being in Congress and being in politics is a rough and tumble business. It should be. People have very diverse ideas. They have very strong opinions, or they wouldn't be there. You wouldn't take the time to run for the U.S. Senate or to run for Congress if you didn't feel strongly about something. But let me remind you, there are some times where we do come together. This year, as partisan as it has been, as the pandemic approached us, Congress passed the CARES Act, which is the largest rescue bill in American history. And it was passed unanimously in both the Senate and the House, and went to the president for his signature. If you look back in history, we have a lot of robust debates, but it's nothing compared to what Hamilton and Jefferson said about each other. I hope some of your students will get a chance to look at the play Hamilton. I'm not sure it's totally historically accurate, but it does give some sense of what was going on back then. And so I don't think because there's partisanship that we should be too worried about it. Let me also tell you that it's a difference in the Reagan administration. The other big difference is the media back then there were really three places to watch the news, and you kind of watched it every night. We've done some other bipartisan things in the Congress. I'll mention one your students might be interested in this year called the Great American Outdoors Act. It is the sort of largest revamping of our national parks, conservation, all types of really great environmental things that were done this year. It passed on a bipartisan basis, and most of your students probably had never heard of it. Because why? Because it didn't make news. If it's not controversial, they're not going to talk about it on the news and so forth. We passed large highway funding bills on a bipartisan basis. We fund the government on a bipartisan basis. We do all kinds of things, but unfortunately, if it's not controversial, I think they start to teach them in journalism school that if it's not controversial, it's not news. Well, it is news, but it gives the sense to the American people that all we do is fight. And there are big differences on the direction of the government. Big, important differences, but we also are functioning and get a lot of things done. So I wouldn't be particularly worried about it.
Okay. As I look back, there's and we've somewhat hit up on this actually a little bit earlier. There was one time I really saw a lot of unity and bipartisanship, and that was unfortunately on a very tragic day that brought us together. Was 9/11. I vividly remember driving around Louisville, seeing numerous cars with American flags right after 9/11. On the Capitol steps, we had Republicans and Democratic lawmakers arm in arm, locked together, singing "God Bless America." You were there. What was 9/11 like in Washington, D.C.? When we went through this horrific event?
Yeah, it's very emotional for me because I was there. I was at the on Capitol Hill when you get this, literally watching on the news like everyone else when this first airplane hit the World Trade Center, and you sort of thought, wow, that's weird, and everyone's watching, and you don't realize what's coming, and then of course the second airplane hits, and where I was on the hill, we were all immediately evacuated because, as you may remember, at some point then one of the airplanes hits the Pentagon, which is just across the river from Capitol Hill, within a few miles of where one of my kids was in daycare. And so, you didn't know what, it was like the world was coming apart. And then there were all kinds of rumors about what was going on. And then there was this fourth airplane that was in the air headed toward Washington. And people thought, maybe it was headed to the White House or maybe it was headed to the Capitol. But I literally remember how scary the evacuation was. It was sort of a run for your life moment. And of course, that airplane ended up going down thanks to some heroes who took it down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And you're right, but the country came together because we were literally under attack. And there was that great moment. I wasn't there for that, but where the Republicans and Democrats and Senator McConnell was there, where they sang spontaneously, "God Bless America" on the steps of the Capitol. I did go to one historic moment. Within about 3 days, President Bush addressed the joint session of Congress, and the guests in the gallery, of course, it was all of the senators and the congressmen, but the guests in the gallery, because security was so tight, were only Capitol Hill staff members. And so I was actually sitting in the gallery listening to that speech. And it was a defining moment. I had said that after the Cold War, that there was this relief that finally we're going to have peace and prosperity. And the war on terrorism came along shortly thereafter. And it changed a lot about how we operate. We created government agencies, the Department of Homeland Security. It was pretty clear that in government there were information was being siloed off. So what the Department of Justice might know about a domestic terrorism situation, maybe the CIA or the FBI or local law enforcement might not know about. And so there was this whole revamping of our government. If you think about how you fly on airplanes, and everything we do now is a little bit different going back to 9/11. It was both a patriotic moment, and it was really an awakening in some ways, that there are a lot of bad people out there. And the problem was, Coach, is that most wars that we had been in before, you sort of knew who the enemy was. Yeah. They had on a uniform, you had on a uniform, you had a war, somebody won, the prisoners of war were exchanged, and everybody kind of went home. This was totally different from that. These are pockets of terrorists in small countries. They didn't wear uniforms. They were fanatics. They were clearly willing to do things that were unspeakable. And that was a whole new situation from what we had dealt with in the past with conflicts that we've had around the world.
And they also would hide behind civilians in their home countries and stuff.
Exactly.
Just using tactics that and we are still seeing the results of this, because we're currently still in our longest war in U.S. history with our war in Afghanistan, which opened right after that terror attack.
That's exactly right. So the 9/11 had a huge impact, not only on how we do things domestically, but we've now been in this war that has gone on seemingly forever. And even though it wasn't particularly controversial at the time, right, that war became controversial as it dragged on. And obviously, when our men and women are being put in harm's way and being killed in a foreign country, at some point, Americans start to think, why are we doing this? Are we having any result here? So there's all types of different viewpoints. You have, in my party, there are some isolationists who don't really think America should be out there. I'm not of that thought. I think America is still the most important country in the world. And that if we don't use our influence diplomatically, militarily, economically, then the world's not going to be a better place. We're going to be worse off. And I know that those long wars are tragic, but the Middle East has been a problem for a very, very long time. Your students, they don't remember how Israel and Egypt, but we've made some progress lately, and
right.
I'm hoping that the Middle East will not continue to be the problem that it has been over the last 25 or 30 years.
Fingers crossed. I've been to Israel, and it's truly an eye-opening country to be at.
Yeah.
Terror, and since we are talking about terror, in 1999, terror took a different form in schools on April 20th at Columbine High School. In the last 10 years, we have seen between 2009 and 2018, there were right at 180 school shootings. One of them here in Kentucky in January of 2018 at Marshall County High School. When I started teaching, we had 3 drills that we had to go through. We had our fire drill, a tornado drill, and an earthquake drill. We've now since added an armed intruder drill, which is something I would have never imagined when I started my career. What is Congress doing to protect schools and students, and what is the vision to try to alleviate these school shootings?
Yeah, Coach, one thing that we didn't talk about in advance of this call is that I'm actually from Marshall County. And I went to Marshall County High School. And so where that tragic shooting took place is also very personal to me, because I walked through those areas and through those rooms and through those hallways when I was in high school. It is one of the most tragic things that our country is facing, because as a parent, when you get your kid to school, you think, well, they're safe, at least for now. You worry about them getting to school, especially if they're 16 or 17 and 18 years old driving,
Right.
and you're worried about them after school based on what they might be doing. But you had this sense that at least during school, they would be safe. And so for that to be, for sort of that to be broken is such a tragedy for our country. And especially, you sort of think of a school as it's where innocent people are gathered for all the right reasons, and you have unstable people who destroy that for us. Congress actually has acted. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but we passed within the last few years. It's called Fix Nix Act, which was to try to revamp the background check system so that hopefully the wrong, people who should not have a firearm don't have access to it, and we're able to, identify those people in advance and beef up that system. We also passed the Stop School Violence Act. This is funding so that schools can have more reinforcements. They can work better with law enforcement. They can have training, probably the training that you and your students are going through. It's tragic that this has to happen, but we live in a mostly free society, really the freest country in the world, and so there's always decisions that have to be made about how much of those freedoms do we want taken away, and we do take freedoms away. We tell people you can't carry a gun into a school, you can't carry a gun into an airport, you can't smoke in certain places, you have to wear a seatbelt when you drive your car, and so the government is constantly in this struggle of what's the appropriate amount of freedom to take away, and how is that offset by safety for people, and especially students. So there's a lot more money has been thrown at the problem. On the federal level, just to remind your students, mostly in a situation like this, what Congress can do is spend more money. A lot of people in my party, that makes them unhappy, but it's a good thing. But the truth is, the answer for a high school in Louisville of school safety isn't really going to come from Washington. It's more likely to come from Frankfurt or the Jefferson County School Board. And what Washington can do, and we've done a lot of it, is provide the resources, because we do spend a lot of money, and this is an area where we are spending more money. We should be spending more money, and hopefully it's going to make a difference.
I would like to see it make a difference, that's for sure, because it is disheartening when you hear of schools where students who are so young, whether from Sandy Hook to Marjory Stoneman Douglas or to our own Marshall County, and just a young life is taken away, as well as faculty members that were there trying to protect those students and things. You're speaking about freedoms and having, for example, some freedoms taken away and things of that sort. Interesting, when we look at our nation as a whole, we see a very divided public. So maybe some part of the public probably thinks certain freedoms could be restricted. Others are very much wanting to protect those. And one of the ways that my students are looking at it right now is from our 2020 election, in which we had over 144 million Americans go to the poll, a record, which was awesome. As somebody that studies history and loves politics, this was a wonderful thing that we had such great voter turnout. We haven't seen this kind of turnout since 1904, so I'm very proud of the American people. But when we look at it and we break down states, for example, in Kentucky, there are 120 counties. 118 counties went red, 2 counties went blue. Those 2 counties were Fayette and Jefferson County, where our cities are. But that was the same kind of pattern in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, all across the U.S. Urban areas go blue, rural areas go red. What does this say about our nation? And is this something that is drawing a concern with Congress and Republican and Democratic parties?
Yeah, well, I think it's true. What you just described is absolutely accurate. Someone said the other day that you could tell how a community voted based on whether they have a Whole Foods or a Cracker Barrel.
I saw that.
and that's sort of true. Rural areas have become redder, more Republican. Urban areas have become bluer, more Democrat, and we just saw that played out again the other day. I think it's part of it is it is partly a way of life that if you live in South Dakota in a very rural area, then it's true that you're probably more likely to be pro Second Amendment. You're probably more likely to be pro-life. You're probably more religious. And if you live in a urban area, the opposite of that is true. And people just approach life differently, whether you're in a rural area or an urban area. I'll give you one example. Someone said, if you live in a very rural community and you have a four-way stop on 2 country roads, that most people think, well, if I pull up there and another car is there, we'll figure it out. I don't need the government telling us who goes first. We're 2 reasonable people who pull up in a cross section of a road and we'll figure it out. If you think about Manhattan in New York City, there's a stoplight and a policeman on every single corner telling people what to do. They're not letting people figure it out because it's not really a reasonable way to do it with so much congestion and so many people and so forth. But what that does, think about this. South Dakota sends senators and congressmen to Washington, and so does Manhattan. And so you put these total 535 people in a room from very different backgrounds, and they have to figure it out as our representatives. And that's why sometimes I think it looks more partisan than it really is. It's because they really do have different viewpoints. They come to Washington with a totally different vantage point of what life should look like and how much government should there be, how much regulation should there be, and so forth. I don't like the trend, but the trend is here. Let me say a little more about why we're in that situation. I think that in some ways, people now, and I'll blame this on the media and partly on the internet and partly on talk radio, is that people now are in a situation where you're not getting information to make a decision, to use your brain. You're listening to information that reinforces what you already think. And so if you're conservative and you only listen to Rush Limbaugh, he's probably going to tell you what you want to hear. And if you're more liberal and you're only listening to MSNBC, then they're probably telling you what you want to hear. That's not good. I don't like that. We need more diverse thought, not less. So I am worried about that. I saw this documentary the other day called The Social Dilemma. And it was talking about how the internet and how Google and how Twitter and these companies operate. And the truth is, what it said is that if you put in the words, is climate change a problem? Depending on where you lived, you got a different answer, which I think is really disturbing. And so what they're trying to say is that probably if you live in rural Kentucky and you put in climate change, you would get something that might say it's a hoax. But if you live in New York City and you put in climate change, it's probably going to talk about why it's a huge problem. That's not good. We need more diverse thought. Your students, Coach, are pretty soon going to be going off to college. And I'm really worried about this lack of discourse on college campuses. That I would really love for college campuses to have lots of thought. Speech is not going to hurt you. More speech is good. More diverse opinions is good. I'd like to, be on a college campus where one week Rachel Maddow is speaking and the next week Tucker Carlson is speaking, and that everybody participate. And this whole nonsense of shouting people down and canceling events because their speech might offend them is really, really scary. We need more diverse thought. And I'm really worried about that because I have kids in college. I see what's going on college campuses. I would just tell your students that, you know, it is a problem when you can't speak on an issue, whether it's liberal or conservative, for fear of being ridiculed or shouted down or canceled or violence. It's a terrible trend in our country. And I do put some of the blame there on our college campuses for not allowing a lot of the very diverse thought. And so if you don't have diverse thought, it creates this more partisan situation that you and I have just been discussing. So sorry for the rant, but I feel really strongly about this, that speech is good. And you look on the Senate floor, turn on C-SPAN 2, and you'll see Ted Cruz speaking and wailing away on some matter, and you'll see Chuck Schumer on the other side. That's good.
Yeah.
Good. That's a lot of diverse opinion, and nobody's throwing something at someone. No one is using vulgar language or inappropriate language. They're expressing their ideas, and that's a really, really good thing. And we need more of it, not less of it.
All right. Since you are talking about my students getting encouraged and to encourage them to be more active, if students were wanting to get in politics, for example, following your footsteps of going to the mailroom in 1984 kind of thing, what kind of suggestions would you have for them in getting involved in politics so that they can start sharing these diverse voices that they may have?
Oh, I hope they will. I'll tell you, it changed my life. I grew up on a small farm in Western Kentucky, and I literally knew no one important. It was just a rural situation, but I always had this interest in government and politics, and I wondered how I could get involved. And so there now I see lots of ways to do it, and I would encourage your students to do it. Number one, you can get involved in a campaign. That's how I did it. I worked on a campaign as a very low-level staff person. And if your candidate wins...
And you can work on a campaign before you're 18 too, correct?
Oh, absolutely. For Senator McConnell's campaign this year, we had tons of teenagers, high schoolers who were involved. And so what does that mean? You start to meet people and if you win, you're going to know someone probably when you get to college. And so what opportunities are there? Internships. We have a very robust internship program with Senator McConnell. I know Congressman Yarmouth does as well. There are the national parties, both the Democrat Party and the National Republican Party have internship programs. So I would encourage your students to apply for those. Most of those are for college students. And then literally, there is no better place if you are interested in politics and history and government than living in Washington, D.C. I actually wrote a piece for Politico a few years ago called How to Get Your First Job in Washington. And if you Google that and my name, you'll see it. And it's sort of 12 steps on what to do to get your first job in Washington. Because even though I got there via a campaign, I took an interest in kids who wanted to go to Washington, and they didn't quite know how to do it. And is it even possible? Can you move from Louisville to Washington and just get a job? The answer absolutely is yes. It won't be the best job. It won't be the perfect job, but it'll be a job and you can live there. And just the fact that you're there where so much history is being made, I strongly encourage you, get on the team you want to be on. If you're a Republican, there are opportunities. If you're a Democrat, there are opportunities in all kinds of ways to impact our government. And I strongly encourage your students to do it because there are a lot of really neat learning opportunities. Also, it's a place where there's a lot of intellectual debate and curiosity, interesting people, mostly young people, and it's a very exciting place to be. Whether you're right in the debate or not, you'll feel like you are because the whole city is sort of consumed with this. And it's a great place to be, and I would encourage your students to do it and to know that it's possible. It's possible to do it if you want to do it, and they need to know that.
One of my students who has an interest in politics, I already had a question for you, Caleb. And Caleb is asking, should the Electoral College be reformed?
Well, Caleb, it's a good question. And there's a lot of debate about that right now. And I would argue that it should not be reformed. It works. First of all, it's in the Constitution. So it's going to be around for a while unless we amend the Constitution. And that's not something we do every day. Why is it important? Because, you know, in our country, you know, elections can be pretty controversial. And right now, we're in a controversial election. In 2000, we were in a controversial election. But imagine if we didn't have the Electoral College. And that meant, you know, votes in every precinct would be contested. So if you think about Jefferson County, there are, in a normal year, 400 or 500 voting locations. And can you imagine that then there are lawsuits in all of those locations? We would be in litigation from the time one presidency started, and we'd still be in it by the time it ended. Because of the Electoral College, most states are decided. You know, here in Kentucky, there have been some irregularities in Kentucky, somewhere in Louisville or in Paducah. Who knows? But because of the electoral system, Trump clearly carried the state, and we're not in court in Kentucky about a particular vote. Right. And in California, there were probably irregularities. But does anyone doubt that Joe Biden didn't carry California? No. So we're not in, you know, we're not in endless litigation over the electoral system. It also, because we have an electoral college, if we didn't have one, big cities would sort of benefit from that. And why is that? Well, you have huge populations, right, close together. That's where the TV and radio stations are. That's where the big media corporations are. And so what would happen? If you were Joe Biden, you would spend most of your time, I suspect, in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, sort of trying to run up the score in those cities. But because we have an electoral college system, where did we see Trump and Biden? We saw them in Michigan. We saw them in rural parts of Minnesota. Oftentimes, it wasn't so competitive this time. Oftentimes, Ohio is, you know, they're going to every little small town in Ohio that you can think of. And it wasn't that long ago, Kentucky was a competitive state. In 1992, Bill Clinton carried it. And I happened to have been here working on the Bush campaign in that year. And the president came here numerous times. The vice president came here. Bill Clinton was here. Hillary Clinton was here. And so we were a competitive state. And I guess I would also say that it's worked. We have competitive elections. We need competitive elections. I'll just give you an example here, and I'm going to look at my notes. If you think about starting in 1952, and you think about electing presidents and whether they were an R Republican or a D or Democrat, let me tell you how it's going. R, R, D, D, R, R, D, R, 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 D, D, R, R, D, D, R, D. Now that's a lot of competitiveness is how I see that. So we have a system that works, and so we ought to keep it because it's created competitive elections for the most part. It's gone back and forth. No one party has become totally dominant, and that's the way it should remain. Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question, and one that you're right. We're starting to hear a lot of discussion about. So thank you for the answer on it. Last question for you, and that is this: again, I was excited that we had such great voter turnout, but when we look at it, 2 out of 3 people voted. That means there's one for every 3 people. There's still one person that didn't vote in this last election, which gives me a big wonder, like, why would somebody not vote? So my last question is for you is, if some of my students who voted for the very first time and others who are just too young to vote, why should they be part of those 2/3 that are going to the poll instead of that 1/3 for whatever reason isn't going to the poll? What is it so important for them to be voting for?
Well, votes matter. One vote matters sometimes. I'll just give you a couple of examples. There was a guy 2 years ago down in Owensboro, not too far from Louisville. He was running for state representative, and he lost by one vote.
Oh, wow.
And actually, he came back this year and ran again, and actually won by several hundred votes. But
Okay.
I remember sort of kidding him about, boy, when you show up to church on Sunday and somebody walks up to you and says, "Oh, I forgot to vote," you're going to have to really restrain yourself, because every vote matters. To put it on a little larger basis, in Senator McConnell's first race in 1984, he won by about 5,000 votes, and there are about 5,000 precincts in Kentucky. And so if one vote in each of those precincts had gone a different way, he very well might not have been elected in 1984. And look, it's the system we have. It's the greatest, is it the perfect system? No. Is it the best system anyone's come up with? Absolutely. Because, people can join together and make a difference. We just saw that in this election. And, it's interesting, because in the election we just had, people also have, you can go into the polling place and vote, and you can also have different opinions. So in this country, it looks like we're going to end up with a Democratic president. It looks like we're going to end up with a Republican Senate. It looks like Republicans made gains in the U.S. House of Representatives, but didn't take control. And so that's how we decide who gets the power. We have the great part of what our founders came up with is that they divided the power between the branches. And the way that expresses itself is by people voting. And so it's really important that your students get out and vote. We should not have mandatory voting. People should not be made to vote. That's what, some countries have that. It's a terrible system. We want civically engaged people, all people, every single person should vote. But it should be a choice of whether you decide to vote or not. And I would strongly encourage your students to be part of that 2/3 that engages civically. And one of the best ways to do that is by voting.
Well, Terry, I told you I'd keep you for 25 to 30 minutes. We're now around 15 minutes. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your insight, your wisdom with our class. We truly appreciate you being here with us and sharing.
Coach, thank you very much. Anytime. Good luck to your students, and good luck to you.
Thanks, Terry.
Thanks again, Terry, so much for being a part of this class. We truly appreciate it. Guys, as you heard, your vote matters. One vote can make a difference. It might not be that one vote up at the top of the ballot, but down the ballot where who determines that's going to fix your potholes, who's going to determine how your schools run, who determines where your county lines are, that's where that one vote will matter. Guys, as always, remain awesome. Be nice. Stay safe. See you, fellas.